welcome everyone. I hope your summers are off to a great start, and I'm so glad that you found your way here tonight to learn from Dr. Watt about Josephus. My name is Natalie Walker, and I'm the manager of college operations here at the Classic Learning Test. For anyone unfamiliar with the CLT, we are a college entrance exam and assessment suite for grades 3 through 12. And one thing that distinguishes the CLT as a test is its content. Most of the passages on any CLT exam come from our author bank, and this is a list comprised of men and women who have contributed to the richness of philosophy and thought that we have inherited. They're authors you're likely to encounter in your college career and the kind you want to engage with throughout your life. So most Thursdays of the academic year and a few weeks this summer, to help us develop a true common canon, a faculty member from one of our partner colleges helps us explore one author from the CLT bank. We have another seminar, same time next week, where I would love to see you. We also hope next year to include student panelists on all of our seminars. So if you know a student or are a student who asks good questions and loves great books, there's more information on the page I'm about to put in the chat now. You'll also be able to register there for our next seminar and for our mailing list so that you never miss one. Tonight we have Geneva College to thank for our event. Geneva is a private Christian college in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, where undergraduates receive a Christ-centered education based on a rigorous liberal arts core. It's recognized as the #6 best value school in regional universities north, and through its first-rate programs and recognized professional accreditation in the engineering fields, Geneva is also named a college of distinction. Dr. Jonathan Watt is a professor of biblical studies and chair of the Department of Bible, Christian Ministries, and Philosophy at Geneva. He was born in Sydney, Australia, and raised in England, the United States, Australia, and Hong Kong. He received his BS in magazine journalism with a minor in German from Syracuse University, his MDiv from Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and his MA and PhD in linguistics from the University of Pittsburgh. He enjoys hiking and camping, remodeling and refinishing furniture, and refurbishing houses, and likes to spend time conversing with college students, including organizing and participating in a variety of international travels. He just came back last week from Italy with Geneva students, and we've been chatting about that. There will be time after the lecture for questions, so please put any questions you have for Dr. Watt in the chat as they occur to you or after the lecture, and we will field those. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Watt. We're so grateful to have you. The screen is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And folks, it's good to be with you this evening, and hope to be able to offer some things of interest with regard to the man who goes by a couple of different names, perhaps most frequently as Flavius or Flavius Josephus. I'll comment on the name in a few minutes and what's unusual about it, but that'll open up a little while as we get into his story. A little bit of background about my interest in Josephus. Is I've been an ordained pastor for more than 40 years. So starting actually nearly 45 years ago, I was starting to do fairly regular teaching and preaching in churches, and wanting to get to understand not only what's on the face of the English Bible, but also wanted to get into the original languages and the culture and the background of both the Old and New Testaments. So I spend time not only in the Hebrew and the Greek of the two Testaments, but also in trying to get to know and understand a little bit of the cultural situations. I do more of that with regard to the New Testament, and that's what led me into discovering a little bit about Josephus. The man is often quoted or referenced, and that alone makes one start to say, well, then, who is this fellow that we keep hearing about and has so much to say? But as I began to get acquainted with his life, frankly, he fascinated me. And in some of the crossfire that has dominated a scholarly study of him, I'll reflect just a little bit on that, but focus mostly on his story. You'll get to see what a really complicated individual he was, but particularly why he gives us a very helpful window into a number of things relating not only to the ancient world in general, To the Jewish world, really, or maybe should say, two different Jewish worlds. He is from what we call the Levant, or Jewish Palestine, the lands on the eastern end of the Mediterranean, but spends the latter part of his life firmly rooted in Rome. For reasons that are going to become apparent. So let me just talk a little while about that. I'm going to give you one or two case studies after I've described a little bit of him. I promise we'll leave plenty of time for questions. I'll do the best I can to answer any questions that you might ask, and I hope you'll come up with some good ones along the way. Josephus is born around the year 37. Now, this is AD 37. So, just to give a reference point, he is born in round numbers a half a dozen years after the life and public ministry of Jesus Christ. So if Jesus is ends his ministry and is put to death and by Christian confession resurrected around the year 30 or thereabouts, Josephus is just a handful of years later, and that's a reference point. And we're not exactly sure when he died. We know where he died, which is Rome, because Rome actually comes to have a certain degree of respect for this unusual resident. You'll see why unusual in a few minutes, and it actually erects an ancient statue in commemoration of him in Rome. Although the statue is now gone, he dies somewhere between 100 and 110 AD once again. So he's living somewhere into his upper 60s, 70s, somewhere in that range. We're not exactly sure. He is primarily known for four works, two of which are of interest to biblical studies people, which is how I get into him. And you're going to see how these come about in the next few minutes. One is called the Jewish War, or the War of the Jews, details forthcoming. And the other, just a magisterial work called Antiquities of the Jews. It's sort of a history of the world from a Jewish perspective, relying heavily on Old Testament or Jewish biblical material, but then adding a whole lot more. It's a very interesting kind of thing that he does, but I'm going to keep on moving. So here's how Josephus comes to such fame and well, influence or counter influence, as the case may be. He grows up obviously a very gifted man. And one of the ways we can measure this, is a number of ways you can measure it. One of the ways we can measure it is that when he is in his 20s, now when he's in his 20s, in the early to mid 60s AD, he becomes part of a delegation of Jewish leaders who are sent from Jerusalem over to Rome to see if they can appeal or argue for the release of certain Jewish leaders who'd been taken prisoners to Rome. This is at a time, by the way, when Rome is just beginning to experience considerable amount of instability under the Emperor Nero. Just a reference point, the Great Fire of Rome is AD 64, and in a time period that's pretty tough. Within a couple of years, Nero will take his own life. There'll be a succession of leaders who die quickly. This is the tough time in Rome, and Jews back in Palestine are trying to take advantage of that because they've been under the Roman thumb at that point for about a century and a half, not quite, and are thinking this might be a time to try and push back and gain some freedom. But by the way, just a reference point once again, 63 BC is when the Roman armies had come in and taken a pretty firm grip of the Jewish Middle East. So anyway, back to what he does. He joins this delegation, or is appointed to it. They go to Rome. And it's interesting, a couple interesting things happen. One of the interesting things that happens is through the particular wife of Nero at that time, who happened to be Jewish, they will successfully make their case. They're going to be able to go back to their homeland, having won their case and bringing their freed rabbinic leader friends back with them. That's the good news. The next piece of news is a mixed bag. Okay, while in Rome, Josephus falls in love, so to speak, with what is developing in the Roman Empire, and he can see the phenomenal architecture of Rome. And by the way, I'll just give a side caution: some of the buildings that you see standing in Rome today may be from the first century or second, but they may actually post date him ever so slightly. The Colosseum has not yet been built at that time, though it will be in Josephus' lifetime. Um, and things like that have not yet been built. But the point is that the city is extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. Okay, that's the mixed bag news, and now the bad news. The delegation returns to Palestine and realizes their home country, this tiny postage stamp of a country. We like to say, I'm located just outside of Pittsburgh. We like to remind people that the Jewish Palestine can fit into Western Pennsylvania very comfortably. It's very, very small. They're in rebellion, and he's going to find himself in a very interesting position. His background, he's from an elite, well-to-do, well-educated family. And I can talk about that, but I think we'll just keep on moving. Um, he's recognized for not only his scholarly abilities, but apparently his leadership abilities. And he will be positioned as one of the key leaders of the Jewish revolt in the northern part of Jewish Palestine. Here's why that's significant. When the Roman armies will eventually come in numbers, and the outcome is going to be absolute bloodshed, I'm afraid. He is positioned in the north, and the route of the armies will be to come across what we today call Turkey and the upper part of the Middle East, and basically they will hit Galilee first. And so his basically pilgrim army, basically, of people who are farmers and rural peoples, not a disciplined, well equipped army. It just basically cannot possibly stand up against the Roman armies. And there's a lot of details, but short version is they will be crushed. And he's leading at a place that it goes by two names, either Yotapata or Yadvod. They briefly resist the Romans, but eventually they're crushed. And Josephus will end up trapped in a cave with about 40 others. 40 companions. The year, by the way, is AD 67. This is about the second year of this Jewish revolt that's going to last a handful more. And what these men decide is better to suicide than to, be taken by the Romans, who will do, whatever. And suicide, in their view, was a more honorable death than trying to, do what you cannot do in fighting. So most of the men take their own lives. Josephus and one companion turn themselves over to the invading army as prisoners. And the particular person in charge at that point is a very important name. I'm going to give you the name. Some of you will know the name. Some of you will perhaps learn at this point. The man's name is Vespasian. Okay, and Vespasian is going to lead this horrific army assault on Jewish Palestine, hitting Galilee and eventually down to Judea. And he gets acquainted with Josephus, and Josephus is going to claim to have had a vision. I'm not going to weigh in yay or nay. I'm just going to tell you what Josephus reports. And in his vision, he then relays to Vespasian, the day is coming when you are going to be recalled to Rome and you are going to become its next emperor. And lo and behold, in a matter of another year or two, that is exactly what happens. Um, don't ask me to explain the how or the why or anything else. I'm just describing the story as Josephus tells it. And he is released. Vespasian goes back to become the emperor, by the way, for the next decade. Let me make a linkage. You probably know about the Colosseum, that massive oval arena, which we could talk for a long time about, but again, won't, because we don't have the time for it today. He'll be the one to complete or nearly complete that. His son Titus will continue the fight in Jewish Palestine, And Josephus will become a negotiator with that son whose name is Titus, who, for a couple of years after the death of Vespasian, around the time of the disaster of Vesuvius and Pompeii and Herculaneum, uh, uh, Josephus will become, anyway, a negotiator, trying to convince his Jewish brethren not to resist Rome. You can't win, give up, better to live. And no one wants to be under Rome, but that's better than the horrible alternative. He's not successful, by the way. Jerusalem falls after a bloody siege, will fall in the year 70, be decimated. The beautiful temple will be destroyed. And again, even the carnage, by the way, is visible today if you visit Jerusalem. That's again another lecture for another time. And so, what's Josephus going to do? Well, as the last phases of the war come, and it's very clear Rome has won. What's left, by the way, is an attack on a fortress called Masada, which is down by the Dead Sea. It's sort of a last holdout of Jewish zealots who joined together with people from Qumran, which is where the Dead Sea Scrolls seem to originate for the most part. 960 men, women, and children suicide there just before being overrun by the Romans in this amazing hilltop fortress. Anyway, that leaves Josephus as a persona non grata. He is back in Rome and will be there for the rest of his life, basically. And he becomes a Roman citizen. And that means he gets a lot of the privileges of the ruling class of Rome. And it gets even better. He's given a patronage by the Flavian family, Vespasian, Titus being the best known of the Flavian family. And he will even be given the country villa that Vespasian had lived in before he moves into the city of Rome itself to become and to rule as its emperor for that roughly next decade, 69 to 79 A.D. And so this Jewish man whose name might have been pronounced something like Yosef, okay, Joseph, as we say in English, will become a client of the emperor himself. He will, others do this for him, Latinize his name, Yosef, add the US suffix for the Latin ending of a masculine noun, and you've got Josephus or Josephus, and the Flavius is the family name, which of course he's not born into, but will take on and is accorded it but by virtue of the circumstances that we've described. So his life over the next handful of decades in Rome, on the one hand, highly privileged, one we would say perhaps well-deserved for someone who had been through those kinds of experiences. He perhaps had been as a young man, a member of the Pharisees in Jewish Palestine, or at least, at the very least, acquainted closely and associating with the Pharisees, a name well known to many, particularly if you know the New Testament. Whatever the exact relationship, it doesn't matter. And because of his background and his upbringing, and now his connections with Rome, for the reasons we've described in brief, he will become, by virtue of his voluminous amount of writing, an invaluable source for information about the Jews, the Jewish homeland, Jewish scriptures, Jewish tradition, Jewish culture and customs, and particularly bringing those to now I'm going to be careful how I frame this here. It's on the one hand, a Latin speaking family and a Latin speaking culture, but in many ways is using Greek as the language of the literate. Okay, so the educated Roman was a bilingual Latin and Greek speaker, and so he gives us information, for example, on the territory of Galilee, which of course he's very familiar with because he had lived and fought there. He gives us information not only about ancient history, which I won't go into, but about things that are touching on the life of the New Testament period. In other words, the first century AD. He gives us information, for example, on Herod the Great, information on the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes, key religious parties at the time. By the way, the Essenes are not mentioned in the New Testament, but they're around and about at that time. The temple at that time, and this magnificent temple that Herod had begun building, about Pontius Pilate, about various people in Herod's family, and so forth. And seems, I'm going to say this cautiously, seems to be basically saying, can I bring this wealth of Jewish knowledge and wisdom and culture, and he's a practicing law-abiding Jew, but bring it to a city and a culture where Jews are known, but they're a very, very small minority. They're there, they're present, people know about them, but they're still in a small minority. And he's going to do so, though he's probably a native speaker of Aramaic, a sister language to Hebrew, probably knows a good bit of Hebrew as well. But he talks about becoming excellent in Greek. I'm going to read just a few words from him, thankfully in translation, from the end of Antiquities. For those of my own nation freely acknowledge that I far exceed them in the learning belonging to the Jews. I've also taken a great deal of pains to obtain the learning of the Greeks and understand the elements of the Greek language. And he likes to boast, and by the way, with some good grounds, that he was so good at Greek, his tertiary language, he could use it almost, not quite, but almost as well as a native speaker. And that's no small accomplishment for someone learning these things later in life. Now, what I thought would be helpful in the remaining time I'd like to take for speaking, because I want to give you lots of opportunities to ask questions. I thought I would give you one or two interesting examples specifically of what he gives us that is so helpful and so intriguing in terms of relationship with the New Testament. So let me mention basically two examples. I'm going to go in reverse chronological order, okay? And then after I've done the second of these two, in the next couple minutes, we'll give you a chance to pose questions. There is, in the last stage of that Jewish revolt that runs from 66 to 73, this holdout at this impressive plateau mountain fortress called Masada. It's spelled either Masada or Massada. You can look it up on the internet, and there's lots of material on it. You will find there in this impressive fortress that is some 1,400 feet above sea level, a practically impregnable place that had been there for centuries, but Herod the Great had vastly fortified it, and it was seemingly, just impervious because of its positioning and defenses, impervious to any kind of attack. In a brilliant way, the Romans will smash through it basically by taking Jewish prisoners and having them build a kind of a man-made dirt saddle that goes up the side of the backside of this fortress area, and basically use a ramming device to smash down a wall, go in. But the night before it is clear it's going to happen, 960 men, women, and children take part in a mass suicide. Josephus gives us the valuable details about that. Now, I'll let you know that some scholars have criticized him as being not sufficiently historical, and no one is perfect, and he may have exaggerated in one thing or another in many of his pieces. But we have a valuable insight into sort of how this revolt came to an end in a tragic event that bears some remarkable parallels. There's some differences too, remarkable parallels to the infamous Jonestown, Guyana death situation of the late 1970s. So Josephus is a primary source for that last holdout at Masada and how the Romans broke in, as well as what the outcome of it was. By the way, if you're a movie goer, there was a movie with Peter O'Toole some years ago on Masada. In my opinion, it's worth seeing so long as you filter one thing out of it. In the movie, the primary invader falls in love with some Jewish woman. That was purely Hollywood, okay? But in terms of its depictions of the warfare, it was filmed on site, and you can still see some of the vestiges of that set many, many decades later. It's a very interesting piece to see, as well as a tragic piece of history that Josephus gives us. I'd like to give you one more example before I wrap up of why Josephus is of such interest to us. And my point here is not to say that he proves the Bible. I'm not. This is not that kind of a gig for me. I'm just giving a correlation with some interesting correlation. That's what I'm doing here. Okay. So in the book of Acts in the New Testament, chapter 12, there's an account that takes place in the year AD 44. Okay. I'm going to read it just a couple lines. It's a very, very short account. There is a grandson of the best known Herod, a guy named Herod the Great. Okay. And this grandson is known as Herod Agrippa the First. Okay. He only gets a 3-year reign. It's a very, very short reign. Well, depending on how long you count the reign and co-reign time, but just a handful of years anyway. And he will just have a little bit of control of a little bit of Jewish Palestine while the Romans are simultaneously present. But this is before the revolt breaks out. And people are always politicking. You know how it works with politics. And this Herod had thought he would sort of play a strong hand by killing one of the apostles, specifically James, the brother of John. But then this event follows that, and I'm reading from the book of Acts 12, chapter 12, verses 20 and following. It talks about a sort of a political situation where there's some tension. The details don't concern us, and then it goes on to tell us that this Herod Agrippa the First, this micro fractional king and grandson of Herod the Great, is going to make a public event someday where he speaks into a crowd and sort of tries to win them over, and has some success, by the way. And it tells us in the book of Acts in the Bible, he puts on royal apparel, delivers a speech, and in response to the speech, the people are crying out, praising the speech. Oh, you have the voice of a god and not of a man. And then Acts tells us suddenly an angel of the Lord struck him because he didn't show honor to God, and he was eaten by worms and died. Okay. And that's roughly what's in the Acts story. Now, what's interesting is Josephus references the same event, adds in a couple of very interesting details. I won't mention all of them, but just a couple of them. And again, I'm not here to say which of these details is he always right in these details. I don't know. I'm just going to tell you as he's telling the details. First off, he explains what the political situation was in the background, which led to this speech that was given at a theater in Caesarea Maritima. You can visit the ruins of that place and actually stand in that theater to this day. If we were there today together, I could actually show you roughly where he was probably seated and how he was standing. Secondly, Josephus tells us that to make a big impression, he had the people who prepare his clothing weave in silver threads into his clothing so that when he stood up to speak and the sun would have come up facing him as he spoke, it made his clothing shimmer. This is a guy who knew Hollywood style impressive tactics and special effects long before most other people were doing them, and people were impressed. He seems to have won them over, and that's good. I guess that makes him a good politician. And then Josephus adds, but as he was accepting all of this praise with what he calls impious flattery, this is Josephus says, Herod Agrippa looks up and he sees an owl sitting on a rope above his head, and immediately understood the bird was the messenger of ill tidings. Now, I'm not sure exactly why an owl on a rope is. I've seen plenty of owls on branches. I hope that's not bad tidings either. And then it says a severe pain arose in his belly in a most violent manner. He looked to his friends and he said, I, whom you call a god, am commanded presently to depart this life. And over the next handful of days, he dies in agony. So you've got, I'm going to call them for now complementary details. How much of Josephus' work is right? I'm not arguing on that one way or the other. I don't know, but it gives us this very lively, personal sort of viewpoint of what's going on. Now Josephus would have been just about 7 years old when this took place. He wasn't there personally, but he has that kind of detail that he's getting from somewhere or someone. And those are the kinds of things that when you bring it all together with so much more that's in there, make him a person just of interest. And uh, uh, and frankly, a kind of a tragic historical figure. And I'm going to put two people together as a way to wrap this portion here. A handful of years ago, we had at Geneva College here a very interesting speaker. For now, I'm going to leave out the name, although he's put his information out publicly. He was brought up as a Palestinian Muslim, Muslim Arab, um, and had close connections with Hamas. And as a young man, he was captured by the Israelis and was turned into a double agent. This is all public information, by the way, but I want to leave out the name of the man for now because that doesn't help. And spent some years giving information about Hamas to the Israelis. Eventually, the information comes out. He comes to the United States. To the best of my knowledge, he may still be living in the United States these days as a kind of a political exile. And when he was speaking at Geneva, he made a very interesting personal comment. It was made publicly, so I'll quote it here. He said, "I can probably never get married," he said, "because who wants to marry me?" He says, "An Arab girl doesn't want to marry me because, in her view, I probably gave away her people. A Jewish girl doesn't want to marry me because I'm an Arab. And what American girl wants to marry me, knowing that every time I go out somewhere publicly and openly, I've got an FBI armed bodyguard traveling with me?" And in other words, I have no home anywhere. And I think of that kind of a quote when I think of Josephus, so firmly rooted in his Jewish life, so roughly transported by the circumstances. And while many people have criticized him as being a coward, he didn't suicide with his friends, or he's finding excuses for writing. I think a man in his own way, what we would call kind of the worst of a third culture kid kind of an experience, and someone who really could never ever fit fully anywhere. He could no longer fit in Palestine, Jewish Palestine, and he certainly would not have fit comfortably in Rome. But there's the man, there's some of his works, and I hope you found that an interesting taste of what we have there. And let's open up. Natalie, perhaps you can broker some questions and comments here.
Definitely. Yeah, what a fascinating life. Yeah, the first one that we have in the chat is, do you understand that Josephus was adopted by the Flavian family, or can you say
Effectively so.
about
That's
that
right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
relationship?
Yep.
Right. And where does one read? It sounds like he wrote an account of his life. Is
Yeah.
that in Antiquities, or
Yeah.
where does one?
So the other two works which I just referenced but didn't identify. One is called Contra Appion, and it's a basically an argument in favor of Judaism against its critics. And then he has his own autobiography. That's correct. So there's a lot of information on him in that autobiography. Yep, that is
Okay,
correct.
great. We have one question asking, can you comment on his writing on Jesus speaking to Jewish leaders?
Yep. Yeah, there's one or two references to Jesus in his work. And I am not a textual critic, so I'm going to stay outside of the argument, but I'm just going to acknowledge that what he has said about Jesus may or may not have been original material to Josephus. So I think probably it's best, yeah, just to be cautious and perhaps sit on the sidelines for now. At least that's the decision I've made with regard to what he says there. Yeah. He's sure, by the way, he surely, at the very, very minimum, he had to have heard about Jesus. There's no way he couldn't have. He interestingly, will talk about the death of James. Here's another interesting connection. Of James. Now, there's multiple so-called Jameses in the New Testament. By the way, in one sense, there are no Jameses in the New Testament. Everyone is really Jacob, okay? But the English translation tradition has customarily converted them to James, okay? And he mentions the death of James in AD 62. Here is what is very interesting, and I find this is considered to be reliable information from Josephus. Is he and I remember James would be, as most Protestants would infer, a natural son of Mary and Joseph, or possibly a son of Joseph by a hypothetical marriage before he was married to Mary. I'm not sure either one necessarily wins out, but the point is, we'll call him a brother, a half brother to Jesus. Um, and James is considered to be a righteous man. He's a good man, and he is basically thrown from the peak of, and we don't know what the peak is, but the peak of the temple, somewhere high up on the temple walls, a drop of how much we don't know, 1 to 200 feet, something like that, nearly dies in the fall, and then is clubbed to death with a fuller's club by someone. Basically, a mob action, disposing of someone who's what we would call them today a Jewish Christian or a Jewish believer in Christ. And Josephus gives us this very valuable information about that. And James has a very, very significant early leadership position in the church. And that's clear, by the way, from Acts 15. He's not one of the original 12 apostles. That's a different James, but clearly has an early leadership role in the church, is probably the writer behind the Epistle of James in the New Testament. He's highly regarded by believers and by Christian believers, but also by Jews. And it's interesting, Josephus looks dimly upon the Jews who orchestrated that death. Josephus is very critical of a number of Jewish leaders who were his personal rivals, as well as the priestly families who, by intrigue and sometimes by murder, were basically abusing their leadership of other Jews. He's obviously not happy with what the Romans did, but he's also fairly critical of what many Jews have been doing as well, and that's one of the examples of that.
Mhm. That's very helpful. Um, there are a number of details, the writings of Josephus that you've been able to kind of bracket and say that you're maybe not interested or don't need to know kind of whether how factual they are or kind of historically veracious. Could you give some advice to especially maybe students on the call, young students, about approaching, yeah, historical texts, primary sources like this,
Sure.
kind of, yeah, how much faith, I guess, to give an author, or like how to use those brackets well, of like maybe the veracity isn't the most important part of what I'm trying to read when I read
Yep.
a his.
Yep. No, it's a great question. Yeah, and it's good to keep in mind the purposes with which an author writes. I mean, that's any author, anytime, any place, any genre, and being aware that they have a reason for, and maybe multiple reasons for doing something, and so therefore they're going to not only choose what they say, but how they say it. Um, and Josephus is writing he's writing a bridge work, Jewish world, Roman world. Now remember, they're not different worlds; they're overlapping worlds. And for that matter, Jews under the Roman Empire were not the same as each other. I was at a conference some years ago on the early Jewish synagogue. Majority of the participants, I believe, were Jewish. And one of the terms they were using, this particular group was using, what they talked about multiple Judaisms, meaning a common core, and yet some very, very different views politically, socially, and so forth. Here's one example of many. in Josephus' day, Josephus makes it clear on the one hand, Jewish tradition has been monogamous. On the other hand, Jews at his time, he claims, many of them were polygamous even in his time. So you've got different views on that. So to hone into your question, what you have is a man who wants to represent the Jewish world in a positive light. And he certainly wants to do that. On the other hand, he's very displeased with the way certain factors came about that led to what will basically be the first of two steps of the undoing of a sort of a unified Judaism in the Middle East. There'll be another revolt, roughly a half century later, in which the Romans just do more massive destruction and then eject Jews from Jerusalem and rename Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina. It won't even be called Jerusalem anymore. So he's unpopular, but to many in his own day. And again, the discussion today ranges. Some Jews find him, well, they accuse him of cowardice. Um, Clearly, some of his numbers are not reliable. So he describes, for example, Galilee as a land of many, many thousands of towns and villages. Well, Galilee is a land of many, many hundreds of towns and villages, but not the massive numbers of thousands that he depicts. It has really only one true city, well, one or two true cities in Jesus' day. Sepphoris is one of them, not mentioned in the New Testament, and then just outside of it, Scythopolis, which could loosely be considered part of that cluster. But it really it's a rural area. I'm not insulting it or critiquing it, but certain things are made a little bit more grand or filled in or heavily relying on oral tradition. Just as writing can be unreliable, oral tradition can be unreliable as well. So we always ought to be just thoughtful and careful about sorting it through.
Yeah. Could you give us some more of the range of thoughts about Josephus today, especially in the Jewish community? Deborah in the chat was wondering about
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, I've encountered. I can't speak for broadly for Jews. I don't know. I would say I periodically hear him criticized, not necessarily by Jewish scholars, but by scholars in general. I'd like to think with 2,000 years space, people can look a little bit more kindly at someone who at least attempted to, on the one hand, serve his own people by the initial trip to Rome, serve his own people as a leader, either a Pharisee or associated with them, serve his own people as surely a general who is posted in an impossible position. No one wants to be put in that. You just know you cannot win in a war like that. And yet he does it. That to me is that's an amazing person. So uh, I'm sure today there's lots of different Jewish opinions on him, no doubt.
Thank you. Um, could you recommend, yeah, how someone might approach his writings for the first time? So is there one you recommend starting with, and
Sure,
any,
sure.
any advice you have for reading as well?
I do actually. There is a volume, and forgive me, I went to look up the exact information just before this, and I didn't have time. But there was a volume put out, I want to say maybe 15 to 20 years ago by a writer named Paul Meyer. And I cannot remember if the name is spelled Maier, or something like that, but it's basically sort of condensed writings of Josephus. And what I might recommend if someone would like the pleasure of reading Josephus without getting into the voluminous amount of material, sort of the condensed works, edited by Paul Meyer, or and there may be other volumes similar, would make, and there's also some nice and helpful illustrations in that, that would be well worth the time, and not so overwhelming as taking on, that most of us have a cheap copy of William Whiston's 18th century work with microprint that makes us go blind. Good to look up stuff, but you don't want to sit there reading it for hours. It's just overwhelming. But I'd recommend something like Paul Meyer's work. Yeah.
That's great. Um, if a if on the call, so we have a lot of CLT students, so high school students and their families represented on the call. If a high school student was reading the essential writings for the first time, what might some questions be that you would ask them, or kind of
Sure.
ask them to the
I'd,
book?
I'd ask them to keep an eye out for a couple things. What are the ways? I'd start actually with the antiquities, because that's the bigger picture. What are the ways in which Josephus is using materials that are in the Jewish Bible, the old, what we call the Old Testament, um, and what are some of the ways in which he's drawing from other traditional literature, because he's doing some of both really and compiling it in his own kind of way. So just keep an eye out for what is his literary compositional style. And if you have a little bit of knowledge of the Old Testament, you'll be able to see where that's coming in. And then there's other, events and people, and you read, I think, I don't recognize that. And that may well have been drawn from some of the traditional material. When reading the Jewish War, which again focuses on the Jewish revolt of 66 to 73, just his detail is amazing. His detail on people's, events that took place that led to something else. It's very helpful to see that kind of thing. I'll be honest, as a high schooler, I had no interest in history whatsoever. To me, it was a boring bunch of facts, figures, and dates. And then I stumbled into a Greco-Roman history course in college and was enthralled, because the man who taught it was, by the way, a very anti-religious man. I discovered later on, had this lovely view of just what makes history history, which is people and their motivations and their brilliance or their blind spots, and the things that they did, bravely, foolishly, or otherwise, that changed everything. It's studying people. So anything that allows you to get to the people side of things, um, that's a great way to go.
Yeah, so Josephus himself seems like, yeah, definitely a person of interest in history. As a historian, does he seem to really enjoy studying people, or is he
Yeah.
insightful about people's
Yeah,
motivation?
you got a little taste of that when I read about Agrippa the First. You're almost. I like to go to that. I've been to the theater at Caesarea numerous times with students usually, and I like to just stand in that theater. And I like to find what my nickname for it is the sweet spot. You stand in a semicircular Roman theater. You move around a little bit until, as you're speaking in a regular voice, you can hear the sound of your voice bounce off, and that's what I call the sweet spot. And I picture the guy, occupying that space. The Mediterranean is behind him. Um, and the sun is coming up from the east, okay, so it's going to shine on him as he looks eastward, and it shines on him and illuminates him. He sees the owl sitting on the rope. Again, whether that was true or not, I don't know, but there's Josephus transporting me into what Herod Agrippa the First is thinking, his motivations, and so forth. That's that's cool stuff.
That's great. We do have time for a few more questions if anyone wants to put some in the chat. And while we sort of wait on that, I wanted to give you a chance to talk maybe a little bit about Geneva College. I don't know if I have any specific questions, but if there's anything you want to highlight for us about the liberal arts core at Geneva, or your
Sure.
own department, or anything you might think especially appeals to kind of homeschool students or
Hmm.
class. education
Sure.
background.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and we homeschooled we have 4 children. They're all now a few decades past that age frame, but we're glad to see them coming to school here. Um, I got involved with Geneva because I came to Beaver Falls. Beaver Falls is just northwest of Pittsburgh, right next to the Ohio border. And I came here to pastor a church that is sort of surrounded by the college territory, so had a natural interconnection there. Finished up my doctoral work and then started teaching part-time and then came over full-time a few years later. And a couple of things that attracted me to Geneva as in the role that I have now. One of them is again, just as you said, it's the liberal arts tradition. Um, it was is strong. In other words, I'm not criticizing a Bible college. They have a purpose, but we are a college that has a Bible department, and our if you will magic word is integration. Well, we have two magic words, which by the way, are not magic. I say that with scare quotes. But we're interested in seeing where does your faith and any zone of interest fit together. So my graduate degree is after seminary linguistics. So I'm interested in looking at languages using the resources of linguistics, um, while also being aware of what the Bible says that might be relevant to this subject. So that's an integrationist interest that fits my area. But we have people in various other areas. We have something like 4 dozen majors here, and we're interested in seeing that kind of an integration take place in any of those majors. We are attuned to the idea that people have a worldview, and we're not unique in saying that. You hear the word used widely in colleges, universities of all kinds. In other words, you have a kind of a home base of knowledge and experience and a way of seeing that tends to influence how you go about the world and what you're doing in it. And it can change, but unless you're conscious of it, you'll simply operate out of it, and you may want to keep a lot of what's in it, or you may want to redirect some of it. So, I'm keeping anchored in your question here, Natalie. In letting people pursue any of the professional areas of interest that they would like, we also want to see that from some kind of a biblical worldview. I'm not saying the biblical worldview. None of us gets to corner the market on that, but at least to participate in that pursuit, that's something we'd like to do. So that's a little bit of what attracted me here. I love working with younger adults. By the way, I love working with older adults too, but it's just an enjoyable way to go.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think questions have slowed down in the chat and we have
Okay.
lots to think about and lots to read as well. I did find so yeah, the work you mentioned earlier, the essential writings, Josephus, Flavius, it's Meyer spelled the way you said,
Okay.
Maier
Good. Okay. Mhm.
on the call.
Thank you. Whoever looked that up, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you all. Okay, great. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Watt. This has been so informative and so helpful.
Right.
Appreciate it.
Take good
All
care.
right. Good night, everyone. Thank you.